In this video, we will not argue about exact numbers, and we will not try to prove who was right. We will try to understand why a number appeared that does not exist in any canon, yet continues to live persistently today. And what happened to the names that history prefers not to speak out loud. No one remembers the exact moment when it happened for the first time. There was no proclamation. There was no dispute. There was not even an objection. Someone simply said, one day. There were more of them. They said it confidently. Not as an assumption. Not as a legend. But as if it had always been known. And what is strange, no one immediately objected. Because numbers in sacred stories are rarely perceived as facts. They are perceived as signs. 12 is not just a quantity. It is a structure. It is order. It is a closed circle that requires no explanation. But when someone adds more names to that circle, the circle stops being closed. It begins to expand. And together with it, memory expands as well. The first communities did not count the way we count today. They did not keep lists for the sake of precision. They remembered for the sake of meaning. And if a name carried meaning, it remained. If not, it gradually disappeared, as if it had never existed. In those years, the word apostle did not yet have clear boundaries. It did not mean a title, but an action. Not a status, but a path. An apostle was someone who had been sent. And being sent meant being absent. Someone who was constantly moving and rarely returning. That is why names were lost. Someone went east and never appeared again. Someone remained in a city that later ceased to exist. Someone was remembered only in one house, one community, one generation. And where writings had not yet become final, and oral tradition lived longer than people, silence appeared. Not empty silence, but silence filled with absence. It was in this silence that other numbers began to appear. At first, cautiously. Not instead of 12. But alongside them. People spoke of those who were present but not part of the circle. Of those who heard but were not named. Of those who left before history learned how to write. And the more years passed, the harder it became to distinguish symbol from person. Because when history remains silent about a name for too long, it does not disappear. It changes form. It becomes a generalization. And from generalizations, numbers are easily formed. This is how the feeling arises that there were more of them. Not because someone deliberately added them, but because memory does not tolerate empty spaces. Later, when texts began to be fixed, another problem appeared. The written word is always selective. It preserves what can be explained. And what does not fit remains between the lines. It is there, between the lines of history, that those later called by other names settled. Disciples. Messengers. Co-workers. Not apostles, but not merely listeners either. And when someone centuries later tried to gather everything together, they faced a question not of faith, but of logic. If there were 12 named, and others who were spoken of but not counted, then how many were there really? This question sounds simple. But it is dangerous. Because the moment you begin to count, you admit that something has been lost. And it is precisely from this moment that history ceases to be a list and becomes a search. A search not for additional names, but for the reasons why some names remained. And others disappeared, as if they had never been spoken aloud. Confusion did not arise suddenly. It grew slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow lengthening in the evening light. In the earliest communities, there was no single center. There was no one city that dictated memory to all others. Each community remembered in its own way. What was a name for some was merely a role for others. What was considered important in one place was not even mentioned in another. This is precisely how different lists appeared, not as an attempt to change the truth, but as reflections of different realities. In letters that circulated between communities, one can find names that appear only once. They are not repeated. They are not explained. They are not framed by stories. They simply exist, and that alone proves enough, generations later, for someone to ask. Who was he really? Such names do not belong to the 12. But neither do they disappear completely. They remain suspended. Over time, assumptions begin to form around them. If a person was nearby, if they were listened to, if they were remembered, then they must have been something more than just a listener. And if they were something more, why are they not in the main list? There was no answer to this question that satisfied everyone. Because the truth here was not lost. It was simply never fixed in time. One thing must be understood: 12 is a number that is easy to remember. It is complete. It is symmetrical. It looks as if no other option could possibly exist. But life almost never looks complete. Life leaves an excess. And this excess is the source of future numbers. When later authors attempted to gather everything together, they were not working with events, but with fragments of memory. Fragments do not fit together perfectly. There are always gaps between them. And those gaps are filled by imagination. Not malicious imagination. Human imagination. This is how formulations such as other messengers, those who were also sent, brothers who walked alongside, come into being. All these phrases subtly suggest that the circle was wider than commonly believed. But wider does not mean clearer. From this arises another problem. When boundaries are blurred, any number seems possible. Some stop at 13. Some recall 70 or 72. And some, much later, try to find a golden mean between symbol and reality. This is how a number emerges that sounds convincing but has no root. It is not anchored in a text. It is not confirmed by a list. It arises as the sum of a feeling: there were more of them than we know. And that feeling becomes stronger than sources. Because people tend to trust not only words, but also the gaps between them. Where there is no answer, an assumption appears. And where an assumption is repeated many times, it turns into a fact. This is how memory works. It does not lie deliberately. It simply cannot endure emptiness. By the time the church begins to systematize texts, the question already exists. It exists not as a threat, but as a background. It is not openly debated. It is not brought to the forefront. But it is present in commentaries, in marginal notes, in annotations. And what about those we did not count? And here another factor appears: silence. Not the absence of words, but deliberate quiet. Because not all stories are equally convenient. Not all names fit equally easily into a single line. When history seeks order, it chooses clarity. And clarity requires limitation. Thus 12 becomes the canon. And everything beyond it becomes commentary. It is precisely within this commentary, on the margins of history, that space for other numbers is born. Not as a challenge, but as an echo of what was too complex to be fully preserved. And the more time passes, the louder this echo becomes. Because every generation wants to know not only what was preserved, but also what was not. There are numbers that people carry like talismans. Not because they are precise, but because they are convenient for a world that longs for order. 12 was exactly such a number. It was elegant, complete, similar to a circle without breaks. Easy to repeat in sermons, easy for a child to remember, easy to place into a scheme. There is something about 12 that calms even those who do not understand why it is 12. And when communities began to grow, when people from different places brought their own traditions, their own emphases, their own cherished names, 12 became the element that allowed everyone to speak a common language. This always happens when history enters collective memory. First, there are many voices. Then, there is a need for one. A need not for truth, but for coherence. Because coherence is easier to defend. Easier to transmit. Easier to preserve. And here, almost imperceptibly, a substitution occurs. Living stories with all their unpredictability retreat. And structure takes their place. Structure does not lie. It simply cuts away the excess so that the form does not collapse. And every time, in some city, someone recalled yet another messenger, another figure, another person with an important role, they seemed to run into an invisible wall. Not a hostile wall. Not an aggressive one. Just a wall built for the sake of order. Yes, they might be told, but this is something else. This is not them. The word others carried more weight in such conversations than any argument. Because once you say others, you create a second circle. And a second circle is always less clear. Less sacred. Less convenient for narration. This is why memory gradually fixes not reality, but a scheme. There is the main circle, the 12. And there is a shadow around it, those who were also there. No one counts the shadow. But it does not disappear. Philosophers like to think that myths are born from imagination. In reality, myths are born from the inability to finish a story. When you are told 12, you feel completeness. But when you hear about others, about additional names, about people who were no less important, that completeness cracks. You feel that something is missing. And then you begin to search. And search is always a risk for a system that has already defined its form. That is why, at some point, the form begins to protect itself. Not harshly. Without declarations. Through language. Language changes so that it leaves no room for doubt. Instead of, there were more of them, people say. There were others, but it is not the same. Instead of, there are different lists, they say. There is one circle, and that is enough. Instead of, some names were lost, they say. If a name was not preserved, then it was meant to be so. These phrases sound calm. Even devout. But they perform the work that power usually performs, they guard boundaries. And here we come to something crucial. When boundaries are guarded for too long, what remains outside them begins to feel forbidden. Not because someone decided so. But because the human mind works this way. If you are told, do not touch, sooner or later you will ask why. And then the second shadow zone, the others, acquires a new status. It becomes a territory where the real truth might be found. This always happens. Because where there is an official version, there arises a need for an unofficial one. Not necessarily more truthful, just different. And now, when someone says 23, they are not talking about history. They are talking about a feeling. The official scheme is not telling us everything. That feeling is the fertile ground for any myth. And it does not require proof. It requires only repetition. The number 23 lives exactly this way. Not as a quotation from a source. But as a response to internal discomfort. To the need to fill the shadow. But before we go too far, we need to take one step back and recall the main point. Apostle, in early tradition did not always mean one of the 12. It often simply meant one who was sent. And this is precisely where the main trap begins. Because the moment you expand the meaning of the word, you also expand the number of people to whom it can be applied. And if you add to the 12 those who were also sent, you inevitably arrive at a larger number. The only question is, who is counting, and how? Words sometimes stop being just words. They become seals. And this is exactly what happened with the word apostle. When communities were small, when everyone knew everyone else, authority was simple, you were either there, or you were not. You either heard it directly, or you heard it from someone who had. The chain was short, and therefore it was strong. But time did what it always does, it stretched the chain. New cities appeared. New communities. New people who wanted to know whom to trust. And with this came a problem that almost no one voiced aloud, but everyone felt. How do you distinguish truth from a convincing imitation? Because the moment a story becomes widespread, it gains not only listeners, but also those who want to speak in its name. And here begins a struggle not for belief, but for legitimacy. Imagine a city where a community already exists, but it is young. People gather quietly, share stories, read letters that arrive from far away. And then someone new appears. He speaks confidently. He knows the right words. He knows the names everyone repeats. He says he came from them. And the community grows still. Because if he truly is from them, then his voice carries weight. And if he is not from them, then this is dangerous, not only for truth, but for order within the community. How can this be verified? No one carries a seal. No one carries documents. No one has proof that says, yes, he is genuine. In such a world, the strongest currency is origin. That is why the word apostle begins to function as a password. Not always spoken directly. Sometimes hinted at. Sometimes conveyed through familiar phrases. Sometimes through the way a story is constructed, as if the speaker knows something others do not. In every community, a simple logic gradually forms. If you are an apostle, you have authority. If you have authority, you are legitimate. But here lies the problem: when the word apostle becomes a synonym for authority, it begins to be used more broadly. Because authority is needed by many. And here a soft shift occurs, one that will later give rise to everything: additional numbers, complete lists, and the very same magnetic 23. At first, an apostle is the one whom everyone calls an apostle. The center. The first circle. Then an apostle becomes someone who acts like an apostle. Someone who travels. Someone who establishes communities. Someone who teaches. Someone who passes things on. Thus the word expands again, but no longer as a primary action, rather as a function of authority. With this expansion, a new reality emerges. In different cities, their own apostolic figures appear. Not in competition with the 12. But as a response to the community's need to have its own bearer of connection to the source. Because if you are in a distant city, if you have never seen the first circle, if there are dozens of roads between you and the center, you want someone nearby who feels like a bridge. People have always done this. They create more bridges than necessary, because they fear the gap. This is why parallel apostolic traditions begin to appear in different places, not openly contradicting the canon, but living alongside it. And here lies a crucial point: these traditions were not always shaped as 23. They could be shorter, longer, different. But they all shared one thing: they attempted to say what the canon did not say explicitly. Between the first circle and us, there were people. This, between, is the strongest magnet for legend. Because, between, implies the existence of an invisible layer of history that never entered the main text. And where there is an invisible layer, there is always the temptation to make it visible. To add names. To add quantity. To add completeness. And now imagine how this mechanism works in the modern world. Someone takes the center, the 12. Adds obvious, important figures who do not fit the original list but are present everywhere. Adds several names from tradition known in specific regions. Adds several more, sent ones, from the broader use of the word. And at some point, they stop at a number that feels neither too small nor too large. Thus a list is born that feels ancient, even though its logic is modern. But let us return to the time when all of this was only beginning. When someone arrived in a city and said, "I am from the apostles," it was more than a phrase. It was a claim to influence. To teaching. To defining what was correct. And communities began to protect themselves from chaos not only through ritual, but through structure. Elders appeared. Teachers appeared. Those who guarded texts appeared. Those who said, "this way, and not otherwise," appeared. And once such a structure emerges, it begins to do what any structure does. It defines boundaries. Who has the right to speak? Who has the right to interpret? Who has the right to call themselves sent? At this moment, the word apostle stops being merely historical. It becomes political. Not political in the modern sense, but in the sense of power within a community. And where a word becomes power, another inevitability appears. Someone will want to possess that word. Someone will begin to claim a connection. Someone will exaggerate proximity. Someone will shape the narrative so that it appears apostolic. Not necessarily with bad intentions. Sometimes simply because it is easier to keep people united that way. But even the best intentions produce the same result. Multiplication. The multiplication of names. The multiplication of roles. The multiplication of apostolic authorities. And here, almost unnoticed, Part 1 approaches its central tension. If the word apostle became a marker of authority, then numbers ceased to be history, and became a struggle over who has the right to be called authentic. A sense of incompleteness rarely arises from evidence. It arises from pauses. From the way history speaks with confidence, and then suddenly falls silent. From names that appear, and never return. From narratives that end not with a period, but with quiet. It is silence that creates suspicion. Not loud. Not aggressive. Quiet, but persistent. A person listens to the story and, at some point, notices. They know the beginning. They know the center. But they do not know the edge. And that edge begins to pull more strongly than anything else. Because the center is explained. But the edge is not. Early narratives were not designed to provide a complete picture. They served a different function, to preserve what mattered most. What could be repeated? What held the community together? What did not require lengthy explanation? Everything else remained in oral memory. And oral memory does not love lists. It loves images. Names. Moments. That is why what was preserved was not how many, but who. And if the who mattered only to one city, one circle, one generation, that name did not become part of the larger story. Not because it was erased. But because history chose what it could carry forward. Here we encounter a paradox. The closer history is to its origins, the less complete it is. The further away we are from those origins, the more we demand completeness. Later generations look back and see fragments. And they feel the urge to do what the first communities never attempted, to count. Because counting feels like regaining control. But in counting, they encounter a problem that arithmetic cannot solve. Where does one draw the line? Do we include those who were present but unnamed? Do we include those remembered only locally? Do we include those called sent in a broader sense? Each answer produces a different number. And then a temptation appears, to say. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. It is this, in between, that gives rise to numbers like 23. It sounds moderate. Not radical. Not canonical, but not fantastic either. Like a compromise between what is written and what is felt. But compromise is not always truth. Sometimes it is simply a way to ease internal tension. There is one more point that is rarely noticed. When people speak of lost names, they often imagine something deliberate, as if someone sat down and decided, this name stays, that one goes. In reality, everything was far simpler, and far more unsettling. Names are lost not because someone removes them. They are lost because they stop being repeated. And what stops being repeated is what is difficult to fit into a scheme. The scheme, in turn, saves memory from collapse. It is a closed circle. For memory to survive, it must simplify. And simplification always pushes something to the edge. When modern readers see that edge, they do not see the mechanism. They see only the result, a gap. And a gap feels like a mistake. So they try to correct it. They search for additional sources. They compile alternative lists. They add familiar-sounding names. They create the feeling that everything is finally in its place. Thus a reconstruction is born that feels like a discovery. And the more often it is repeated, the less important the question becomes. Where did this come from? Because at a certain point, the number begins to live on its own. It is no longer questioned. It is quoted. And this is what happens to every myth. It begins to look older than it actually is. 23 apostles sounds like ancient knowledge that simply lay hidden beneath layers of dust. But if one looks closely, something else becomes visible. This is a modern response to an ancient silence. Not a denial of faith. Not an exposure. But an attempt to say, nothing was lost, everything can be restored. But history rarely grants such comfort. Because some names were important only for their time, and only then. Some stories were powerful only in a specific place, and nowhere else. Some figures fulfilled their role, and then disappeared from view. Not as a tragedy. As movement. And when we attempt to return all of them in the form of a list, we are doing something deeply human, but not always historically accurate. We are trying to quiet the silence. History does not tolerate emptiness. If it is left unattended, it fills itself. This is exactly what happened after the earliest narratives stopped being merely memory and began to serve as foundations for communities. Because communities could not live on remembrance alone. They needed answers, here and now. Who has the right to teach? Who may interpret? Whom can one trust when there is neither the first circle nor those who stood closest to the beginning? These questions were not theoretical. They were practical. On them depended whether a community would remain united or fragment into competing voices. And in every city, these questions were answered differently. In one place, people remembered someone who had once arrived, left behind a few letters, taught several families, and moved on. His name was spoken with respect, even if it did not belong to the central list. For that community, he was almost an apostle, because without him, the community would not have existed at all. In another place, a different figure was remembered. There, he was the one who brought the message. Not part of the first circle. Not one of the 12. But important enough to be recalled as a foundation. Over time, such local memories began to live lives of their own. Because communal memory is not an archive. It is an instrument of identity. When people say, we had our own, they are not only speaking about the past. They are asserting a right to belong to the story. This is why different apostolic lines began to appear in different places. Not as competition with the canon, but as a way of saying, we, too, have roots. And the more such roots appeared, the harder it became to reduce them to a single list. Because now the apostle was no longer only a figure of the past. He became a bridge between past and present. Someone through whom the community could feel that it was not accidental. And here another quiet shift occurred. If a community possessed an apostolic ancestor, it automatically gained authority. Its words sounded not like opinion, but like inheritance. Its tradition appeared not new, but transmitted. This gave confidence. And confidence is power. This is why different communities began to emphasize their connections to the sent ones. Not always precisely. Not always consistently. But always convincingly for those on the inside. From this arises a phenomenon that is often overlooked. History ceases to be singular. And becomes a network of histories. Within this network, the same names may carry different weight. In some places they are central. In others, peripheral. In still others, entirely absent. This is normal for a living tradition. But dangerous for anyone seeking a single number. Because a network cannot be counted like a list. When later writers attempted to bring different traditions together, they faced a choice: either acknowledge that memory was diverse, or find a formula that would allow it to appear unified. The formula seemed easier. And it is here that the process begins which later gives rise to modern myths. Different local apostolic figures begin to overlap. Someone becomes known in several regions at once. Someone acquires multiple names. Someone merges with another figure. Gradually, a sense emerges that there were more apostles than is usually believed. Not because anyone counted them, but because they could not be reduced to a single face. This is precisely where the internal logic of a number like 23 takes shape. Because if each community adds a few significant names to the center, the total inevitably grows. And if one looks at this from centuries away, without context, without local nuance, without understanding why those names mattered there, it appears as if a general list must exist somewhere. But such a list never existed. What existed was a network. And a network is something the modern mind dislikes. Because it offers no clarity. No final answer. No definitive statement of, this is how it was. That is why the myth of 23 apostles is so attractive. It turns a network into a list. It makes complexity simple. And difference, uniform. But in doing so, it erases the most important thing. The fact that early history lived not through numbers, but through relationships. And relationships cannot be compressed into a single number without losing meaning. When a community begins to say, we had our own, it does more than remember the past. It draws a boundary. Not to separate itself from others, but to avoid dissolving. Because when a story grows large, it is easy to get lost within it. And then people search not for truth, but for closeness. They want to know that between them and the origins there is not an abstract list, but a living line. This is how apostolic figures begin to function as roots. And roots are rarely identical in different places. In one city, a person who once arrived by sea is remembered with special reverence. He did not leave many words, but he left behind a community. His name is repeated whenever people wish to emphasize antiquity and continuity. In another place, they remember someone who taught people how to gather together, who told stories and then moved on. His name is not always spoken aloud, but it is present in rituals, in the form of gatherings, in habits. These people were not the center. But without them, the center would have remained distant. And here there is an important detail that is often overlooked. When a community speaks of its apostolic ancestor, it does not necessarily mean a title. It speaks of a connection. Of someone who passed on not only words, but a way of being together. But over time, this connection begins to be described in a language that everyone understands, the language of authority. Thus phrases change. Instead of, the one who brought it, people say, the one who was sent. Instead of, the one we remember, they say, the one who stood close to the beginning. Instead of a living story, a formula. These formulas are not always false. But they simplify. And every simplification makes different stories resemble one another. This is why, over time, local figures begin to look as though they belong to one great circle, even though in reality they belong to different paths. And when someone, looking from a great distance, tries to assemble a general picture, they see not a mosaic, but a pile of stones. And they begin to arrange them into something familiar, a circle, a list, a number. This is how another important effect arises. The further one moves away from events, the greater the trust placed in generalizations. Because generalization relieves tension. There is no need to know all the details. No need to understand why one place was different from another. It is enough to say, there were more of them. And here a new type of narrator appears. Not a participant. Not a bearer of memory. But a collector. He did not live in that reality. He lives in the reality of texts, lists, traditions, quotations. He does not feel why a certain name mattered in a particular place. He sees only that the name is repeated. And repetition appears to him as proof. It is precisely such collectors, not out of malice, not out of deception, who create the illusion of greater numbers. Because for them, each repeated name becomes a brick in a structure they want to complete. But that structure is built without a foundation of place. It looks convincing. But it floats. And here we approach yet another reason why the number 23 takes root so easily. It does not require explanation. It does not need to be defended with complex arguments. It does not need to be tied to a specific document. It is enough to say, there is such an opinion. Some believe. There exists a version. And that is enough, because a version fills a void. Especially in a culture that favors quick answers. That is why the myth does not appear as a myth. It appears as an alternative to the official, and the alternative always feels bolder. But there is another, deeper layer. Why is it so important to people that there were more apostles? Because more means closer. If there were only 12, they seem distant, almost unreachable. If there were more, the distance between them and us becomes smaller. Greater numbers create an illusion of accessibility. And this illusion is comforting. Because it suggests that the path was not closed, that it was possible to enter it. This is exactly what feeds modern reconstructions. Not a desire to undermine faith. But a desire to come closer to the origins. And the paradox is that the more people attempt to draw closer through numbers, the further they move away from the real picture, living, diverse, and unharmonized. A picture in which there was no single list. But many paths. When a community begins to say, we had our own, it does more than remember the past. It draws a boundary. The sense of hidden names does not arise when there is evidence. It arises when there is asymmetry. When some figures are described in detail, while others are mentioned only in passing. When some names are repeated again and again, while others appear once, and vanish. When history seems to say, this is the main thing, without explaining why it is the main thing. To the modern reader, such asymmetry appears suspicious. Because we are accustomed to completeness. To inventories. To archives where everything has its place. But the early world was not an archive. It was movement. And movement does not leave equal traces. In the earliest texts and traditions, names served a function, not a commemorative role. If a name helped convey meaning, it was preserved. If it did not, it might not be repeated, even if the person was real and significant. This was not a decision to erase. It was a decision to not carry forward. And here a dangerous trap emerges for later generations. Because when you see that a name was not carried forward, you begin to search for a reason. And the simplest reason suggested by imagination is, it was hidden. Thus silence begins to look intentional. And intentional silence always produces suspicion. At this point, modern consciousness takes another step, it begins to read silence as a sign. If little is said about someone, they must have been inconvenient. If a name appears only in marginal notes, it must not have fit. If there is no clear story, it must not have been allowed to survive. These assumptions sound logical. But they are based not on facts, but on expectations. Expectations that history should be fair and complete. But history has never been either. It was survival. And when early communities chose what to pass on, they were not thinking about future reconstructions. They were thinking about what would help them endure today. What could be repeated safely. What everyone could understand. In such logic, complex, ambiguous, unformatted figures always end up at the margins. Not as enemies, but as those who are difficult to explain briefly. It is precisely from these margins that modern interpretations begin to draw. Because the margin looks like a forbidden zone. And a forbidden zone always attracts. Here another confusion emerges, between absence and concealment. Absence is when something did not reach us. Concealment is when something was not meant to reach us. These two are easily confused when viewed from a great distance. Especially in an age where mystery sells better than complexity. This is why modern narratives so often say, there are names that were not told. There were apostles who were removed. There is truth that was not allowed to be known. These phrases sound powerful. But they replace a complex reality with a simple drama. Because reality was not dramatic. It was fragmented. And in that fragmentation there is no single villain. Only time, distance, and human memory. But imagination does not like such answers. It wants cause. It wants intention. It wants a story with a clear conflict. And so the image of hidden apostles is born. Not as a fact, but as a narrative. And when this narrative is added to the already existing confusion of terms, roles, and local traditions, it creates the perfect ground for a number that seems to stand between canon and legend. Here, 23 stops being just a number. It becomes an answer to suspicion. There were more, but not all were named. Some were forgotten, some were not remembered. That is why the list feels incomplete. This explanation is comforting. Because it provides a clear reason for complexity. But complexity does not always require conspiracy. And now we arrive at a crucial distinction. There is a difference between what history did not manage to preserve. And what it decided not to preserve. In the first case, we have silence. In the second, traces of struggle. And when one looks closely, most of the additional names show no signs of struggle. They are not crossed out. Not banned. Not condemned in texts. They simply did not become central. This does not make them less real. But it also does not make them part of the canonical circle. This is the thin line that modern interpretations often erase. Because erasing boundaries is easier than explaining how they formed. And within that erased boundary, the feeling arises that something was hidden. And feeling is what people often call truth, even when it has no source. At some point, it becomes clear. This is no longer a story about apostles. It is a story about need. Because if people truly cared only about how many there were, this conversation would have ended long ago. It would have been enough to say, 12 is a symbolic number, others existed, but they were not part of that circle. End of story. But the conversation does not end. It returns again and again. In different forms. Under different titles. With different numbers. That means only one thing. The issue is not arithmetic. The issue is what we are looking for when we count. Modern people look at the past and see structure. Canon. Lists. Order. But at the same time, they feel that behind this structure there was something alive that did not fit into the frame. And instead of accepting that tension, they try to neutralize it. By adding. By alternative versions. By complete lists. By numbers that feel concrete enough to bring comfort. 23, in this sense, is not a discovery. It is a compromise. A compromise between canon and the feeling that canon did not say everything. Between respect for tradition and the desire to be one step ahead. Between faith and distrust. And this compromise feels safe. It does not deny the 12. It simply adds to them. But that addition is the key. Because every addition shifts the focus. Instead of asking why these stories were preserved, we ask which other stories might have existed. This is a natural question. But it becomes dangerous when answered with a list. Because a list creates the illusion that something has been recovered. In reality, we have only replaced one form of uncertainty with another. Early communities lived without complete lists. Without exact numbers. Without the need to close every gap. Their memory was functional, it preserved what worked. What could be transmitted. What held people together. Everything else remained in the shadows. Not as a prohibition, but as a limit of memory. Modern people live differently. We want to know everything. We want to restore every name. We want history to be fair and complete. But history is not obligated to be either. It is obligated only to be honest about its limitations. And when we look at 23 apostles, we are not seeing a fact from the past. We are seeing a reaction of the present. A reaction to silence. A reaction to incompleteness. A reaction to the fact that not everything can be reduced to a clear scheme. This does not mean that 23 is deception. It means it is an answer not of history, but of psychology. Because we want to believe that the path was wider. That access was more open. That truth did not belong to only a few. And there is nothing wrong with that desire. But it does not make the number historical. The real truth lies elsewhere. There were not more apostles, and there were not fewer. There were exactly as many as memory was able to retain. Everything beyond that is not hidden. It simply did not become central. And perhaps this is the most important lesson of this story. Not everything important becomes canon. Not every meaningful person enters a list. Not every name survives centuries. But that does not mean they did not exist. And it does not mean that we need to invent a new number so they can return. Sometimes, it is enough to accept silence. Because silence is not emptiness. It is the trace of something that was once alive.